everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with introductions because this is a pretty quick talk. So my name is Sarah Rosenkrantz. I'm the Exhibits and Education Assistant here at the IU Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. And before we get too far along, I would like to go ahead and acknowledge that IU Bloomington is on the traditional homelands of the Miami, Shawnee, Potawatomi, and Delaware people, and these people still have thriving cultures that impact the region today. And if you are in the area, I encourage you to learn more about them. And if you are not in Bloomington, I encourage you to learn about the Indigenous peoples in your area. And this is our Coffee and Curator talk for the month. And we do these every month. It'll be a 10-minute talk followed by a 10-minute Q&A. So if you have questions throughout the speech, just put them in the chat and I will read them off to Jennifer at the end of the program. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker. Jennifer Goodlander is an associate professor of comparative literature at Indiana University. She centers puppetry and objects to explore tensions between tradition and modernity in transnational performance, literature, and other arts in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. She investigates productive boundaries between text, embodiment, material culture, and visibility through an ethnographic lens. Her two books, Women in the Shadows, Gender Puppets and the Power of Tradition in Bali, and Puppets in Cities, Articulating Identity in Southeast Asia, focuses on puppetry, one of the oldest and most dynamic performances of Southeast Asia. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. And just as a side note, I'm recording from home and I have two small young dogs who have been given really good treats, but it is windy here and every now and then they get excited. So hopefully they'll be quiet for us. Anyways, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here to talk about an upcoming exhibit I'm curating at the IUMAA called Paths to Understanding Puppets and People. It is scheduled to open in 2025. So that might seem like a long ways off, but producing an exhibit requires a great deal of research, writing, collecting, and planning. It also takes a team, and I want to acknowledge the tremendous work that Sarah Junk-Hatcher, Sarah Rosenkrantz, Ellen Sieber, Matthew Sieber, Judith Kirk, and the rest of the staff, interns, and students have already contributed as we imagine what an exhibit on puppetry will be and what it will contribute to how we understand the world and its cultures. So the first thing you may be wondering is, why puppets? So most of us in the US think of puppetry as children's entertainment, maybe for church or education, or perhaps you loved watching the Muppets as a child. And I don't mean to discredit the importance and fun of puppets in these contexts, but can puppets really tell us anything serious about the world? Actually, around the world, puppetry is one of the oldest performing arts and is often connected to heritage and identity. So although there's many different forms, all puppetry involves the animation of an inanimate object to tell a story. Some genres of performance date back to 4,000 years ago, making puppetry one of the oldest kinds of human expression. So puppetry has also seen an explosion of contemporary practices, from Star Wars shadow puppets in Malaysia to Sesame Street characters teaching about AIDS in Africa, and even here in the US, the National Theater's production of War Horse won the Tony Award for Best Play. So puppets are familiar to many people, and this familiarity and the often human shape of the puppets allows the viewer to readily connect with them on a personal level. So the centerpiece of Puppets and Passages will be an exhibit of puppets and related objects from around the world, but especially Mali, South Africa, Indonesia, Turkey, and the United States. Placing these geographically distinct puppets in dialogue with one another allows us to show how play, performance, and puppets create a stage for people to make cross-cultural comparisons and learn stories about themselves and others. So this exhibit will demonstrate that puppets are deeply rooted in tradition and yet important to contemporary practice and performance. Additionally, they are evidence of interconnectedness between cultures, generations, time periods, and more. We hope that people will see themselves in this and their stories reflected in global puppet traditions, which in turn will help visitors to develop greater empathy and understanding of people around the world. One of the unique qualities of puppets as material culture is that they're meant for performance. A puppet really comes alive through manipulation by a puppeteer and observation by a spectator. One goal of the exhibit is to play with and think about this relationship between object and performance. I began experimenting with this aspect of puppets and museums in a class I taught, an exhibit that I curated with my students at the Mathers Museum of World Cultures in 2014. The exhibit focused on Indonesian puppetry and was called Still/Moving. And that name was a play on the idea that the puppets in the museum were still, but that moving is an important element of performance. So I'm going to show some of the different things we came up with. One exhibit to show how the puppets were used in performance was a life-size diorama. This is Balinese wayang kulit, and you can see how the puppeteer sits behind the screen and manipulates the puppets. And then audience members could walk around and see what the performance would look like on the shadow side. Also, we had a display case showing the various tools and steps used to make puppets for performance. This is one of my favorites. So these are clown characters in a Balinese wayang kulit, and they tell jokes and translate the performance for the audience. And so we invited the audience to be able to manipulate the puppets. You can see their sticks are below the case there, allowed people to move their mouths, move their arms. On the other side, they could then watch the puppets on the shadow side. We had a script of some jokes and things that the puppets might talk about, but we also invited the audience to make their own performance with the puppets. At the end of the exhibit, we also had an area where people could make and design their own puppet and then manipulate it against the screen. So for this exhibit, Puppets and Passages, we'll use puppets that are already in the museum's collection, puppets from other units on campus, such as the Eskenazi Art Museum, some puppets from my personal collection, and some puppets that will be acquired and added to the museum's collection. I'm especially excited to meet with some of the puppet makers and performers in order to collect photos and videos to use in the exhibit. In the time that I have left, I want to introduce some of the different puppet genres that will be in the exhibit and talk a little bit about where they're from and how they are used in performance. So one of the main themes of the exhibit is tradition. So of course, we'll have more puppets from Indonesia, but we're also going to have puppets from Turkey and Mali. Shadow puppetry from Turkey, which is known as Karagöz, it's named after the central character, reflect both Turkey's past and present. It features a single puppeteer who improvises the story based on myths and histories. Karagöz dates back at least to the 16th century and likely developed from influences from China, Indonesia, and Egypt. Since the Ottoman Empire, Karagöz has been a popular entertainment for urban working class audiences. These comedic performances often subverted political hierarchies and commented on current events and politics. During different moments in history, the elites, whether they were Turkish rulers or European visitors, often condemned the art form for its base humor and political satire. Karagöz, however, has been developed within the 20th century as an important marker of Turkish identity and culture. The puppets from Mali offer another opportunity to explore religion and ethnic identity through puppets. Like Indonesia, the continent of Africa is vast and contains many different ethnic groups and cultures that are perhaps not best represented by only national boundaries. So the puppets in the IUMAA's collections are from a performance festival called Sogobo by the Bamana people in Mali. These yearly festivals are coordinated by youth organizations in order to celebrate the harvest and to bring the community together. Many of the puppets depict various bush animals and thus exemplify different kind of people or behaviors that would resonate with the audience. So for example, Kono or birds represent destiny, and the antelope represents community elders and their wisdom. This might be a surprise to some, but we also have a long tradition of puppetry in the United States. So part of the exhibit will give a brief overview of some key moments in puppetry's history in the US. The first puppets in North America are from the various tribes of Native Americans who used puppets in ceremonial and ritual celebrations. Other styles of puppetry were brought to the US from Europe through immigration. So even though we think of puppets as children's entertainment, popular puppet performances in the 18th and 19th century were primarily for adults and features marionettes, trick shadow puppets, and the ever popular Punch and Judy. These performances toured the country with various sideshows, but they also played on Broadway and in Radio City Music Hall. Puppetry as an American tradition reaches into the 20th century with puppets in both cult and popular culture. Television shows like Howdy Doody, Sesame Street, and The Muppet Show have made puppets a part of children's lives for generations. And cult classics like The Dark Crystal have recently made a resurgence. Fan favorites like Yoda in Star Wars or Baby Yoda in The Mandalorian demonstrate how effective puppets can be in leading roles. The giant puppets in festivals such as the balloon characters in Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in New York City provide us with another key example of 20th century puppetry. So learning part of the history of American puppetry will give visitors a foundation for understanding other cultures' traditions by complicating definitions and understandings of tradition. So the focus is on how tradition functions within contemporary society and identity, rather than tradition as something from a distant and murky past. The idea is that traditions are constantly being invented. So right now we're in the research phase of prepping for the exhibit. I have been reviewing what we have in our collections and making connections with experts around the globe to learn more about these puppets and their performances. Last year, I traveled to both Indonesia and South Africa to connect with puppeteers there. Next, I hope to participate in a faculty exchange in Turkey. We are also working to learn more about puppets and attitudes about puppets here in Indiana. One way we did this was through a puppet activity and survey at one of last fall's First Thursday events. At the event, we asked people to make a puppet that represented their identity out of a paper bag. There were lots of fun puppets, and we are hoping to develop this activity as an interactive part of the exhibit where participants will be invited to add their puppet to those on display in order to put local and global identities in direct conversation. We also asked folks to complete a short survey about some of the ideas they had about puppetry. The first question asked how they would define a puppet. Each answer was different, but there were many trends throughout the answers. Character, story, manipulated or controlled were common in many of the responses. One of the most unique responses said, scary. I'm looking forward to continuing to ask these questions and to think about how to present the variety of responses. So many of the puppet characters that people named in the survey were from Muppets of Sesame Street, and some also mentioned Pinocchio. Yoda and Lamb Chop were the other two ones that people commonly answered. The last question asked if people thought that puppetry was a modern art form. And on this, the answers were split. Some people felt that surely technology would take over for puppets, while others thought they were important to society and history. So whether on stage, in stories, as playthings, in rituals, or even in museums, puppetry offers a dynamic lens into how humans create, relate, and play. So I hope you will stay tuned as we continue along this puppet adventure, and we look forward to seeing you in 2025. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was great. So as I said at the beginning, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat and I'll read them to Jennifer. I thought I'd go ahead and get us started with one. Do you
Great.
have a favorite puppetry tradition that you're excited to share in the exhibit?
Well, of course, Balinese wayang kulit is the puppetry tradition I've spent the most time with. I also am really inspired by some of the new puppetry and contemporary puppetry that's happening in South Africa, because that's going to be one of the categories. I talked mostly about tradition today, but like there's a group out in a village called Net for Pret, and they're using puppetry as education, and they've created these like yearly puppet spectacles that are also starting to draw tourists and people from all over the world. And it was really neat to meet those artists and to see some of their work.
That's really cool. You also mentioned that there are like some Star Wars characters popping up in like traditional shadow puppets. Has there been any pushback for that, or have people like just embraced that as part of the tradition?
Oh, no, I mean, I've seen all over Indonesia, they'll make puppets of like Barack Obama, Donald Trump. So they are constantly, even these kind of like you think of traditional forms are constantly in conversation with things that are happening in pop culture and politics. The Star Wars puppetry in Malaysia is by a group called Fusion Wayang. They have a ton of videos on the web. I highly suggest that you look at it. But it was a group who felt that traditional puppetry in Malaysia was really in danger of dying out. And they wanted to kind of rejuvenate interest in the art form. And they felt that for a contemporary audience, that Star Wars was a story that everyone knew. So they worked with traditional puppeteers to sort of reimagine these characters within that aesthetic. And they've got the blessing of the George Lucas Foundation. Malaysia actually has one of the largest Star Wars fan clubs. But yeah, they've been really successful in generating interest about this art form. And they usually will pair, you know, the Star Wars puppet performance with a more traditional puppet performance. So audiences are getting a chance to learn about both.
That's really amazing.
So
And not
fun.
something I would expect in Malaysia. That's awesome. So, if someone wanted to learn more about puppetry or kind of get their toes wet in getting into it, are there any resources you would suggest?
Oh, there's so many great resources out there. The Jim Henson Foundation does a really good job of like publicizing puppet performances and workshops that are occurring around the country, and you can sign up for their email list. Also in Chicago, there is a yearly puppet festival that happens in January, so that's fun to watch for. If you're local to Bloomington, myself and Dr. Jenny Lale, who's in the theater department, we're actually co-teaching a class in the fall on puppetry. It's going to be focused on both practice as well as puppetry in literature and looking at them globally. And both undergrads and graduate students are welcome to sign up for that class. So there's so many great resources. There's also IUMAA, which if UNIMA is the International Puppet Association, and they're also a great resource for puppetry around the world.
Well, awesome. Thanks. Um, I don't see any more questions coming through on the chat. So maybe we'll wrap it up. But this was really great, Jennifer. Thank you so much. And to everyone in attendance, thank you for being here. We do these talks once a month. Our next one will be on March 23rd, and one of our practicum students is going to discuss the use of red coral in jewelry from the Middle East and North Africa. So it'll be really great.
Actually, Jennifer, I did have a question. This is Kelsey
Oh, sure. Yeah.
coming through. There was a message to me. There is someone who has a roommate in college from Chennai. She gave me 2 Rajasthani puppets. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. Will you have some of those displayed? I know she told me typically homeless children make them and sell them to tourists. Do you know more about that?
I do not know about those, though I would love to learn more. I mean, one of the things you start learning about puppetry is that there are so many different types and forms from around the world. We are using what is already in the museum's collection as sort of our starting place. That's how we picked focusing on Indonesia and Mali and Turkey, but it's not to discount that there's so many other amazing puppet forms.
Thank you.
All right. I think that's it. And I think if you have any more questions, Jennifer is happy for you to email them to her, or you can email us at the museum, and all of our emails are on the website.
Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you in 2025.
Yeah.